I welcome everybody this morning to Psalm 123 as we honored Richard Henley, who's been a regular in the course of our Psalm study. And again, to each of you, whenever you're able to come, I know it's different for different people. It is very gratifying to have students, fellow learners, that puts the wind in my sails. And getting to 123, all the more where it's only 4 verses, getting to 150 now feels doable. And I could not have gotten this far without each of you and the time you do share. So we dedicate our study this morning to Richard, our scholar athlete, and we'll give you a few words before Kaddish Richard to say something. Psalm 123 is only 4 verses. A modern Israeli who wrote a 2-volume work for Mossad HaRav Kook in 86 and 87, his name is Amos Hacham. He said that when you get to the end of the psalm, it kind of ends abruptly, as if the speaker is so sad he can't go on anymore. So there is this quality to this psalm about sadness, but it's on behalf of the people. Verse 1 will have I, and then verses 2, 3, and 4 will be in the plural. Something is going on, but we're not told what. There is communal suffering. And with that, let me read it, and then there will be much to share. Psalm 123, in terms of choosing the title, I chose the 2 words that are probably most reflective of the psalm, in that eyes appears 4 times and our appears 6 times. And this phrase, our eyes are toward Adonai, is the middle 3 words of the psalm. Psalm 123. I'm first going to read it in English and then in Hebrew, because it's short enough to have time to do both. And I want you to hear all the news in the Hebrew, which means us. In English first. A song of ascents. To you I lift up my eyes, dweller in the heavens. Behold, as the eyes of slaves toward the hand of their master, as the eyes of a maidservant toward the hand of her mistress, so our eyes are toward Adonai our God, until God grants us grace. Grant us grace, Adonai, grant us grace. For we are overly sated with scorn. Overly sated is our soul with the mockery of the smug, the scorn of arrogant oppressors. And now in Hebrew, again, listen for this kind of rhythm and a reoccurring sound of new, not like in the Yiddish, like not new like already, but new like us. Shir hama'alot, elecha nasati et einai hayoshvim bashamayim. Hine, che'enei avadim el yad adonehem, ke'enei shivcha el yad gevirtah, ken einenu el Adonai Eloheinu, ad shechanenenu, chanenu Adonai chanenu, ki rav savanu vuz, Rabat Savalah Nafshenu, Halaag Hasha'ananim, Habuz, Ligei Yonim. And so this rhythm that you find, particularly in the middle, is us. Something is happening to the collective that's a source of pain, a source of prayer toward God to heal or change. And now from the beginning. Again, the phrase Shir HaMa'alot is one of 15 psalms that are grouped together. Scholars say that the identification, this introduction of Song of Ascents, is added on maybe after these psalms were written as a grouping. One of the qualities of ascent, of kind of a stepping stone, the fancy term in poetry is anadiplosis. Anadiplosis are terms are repeated to create an interlocking chain. So look here, for instance, at how words are repeated. Verse 1, Adonai links to verse 2, Ene, eyes. And then Che'ene, you get 3 of those as a chain at the verses 1 and 2. You get it 3 times. There's 3 eyes in verse 2. And then the next kind of this anadiplosis, you get in verse 2, the last word, Shechanenu, grant grace. And then you get it twice in verse 3, Chanenu, Adonai, Chanenu. You then have the next step is verse 3, the word Rav, meaning here overly or much. And again, verse 4, Rabat. And last, at the end of verse 3, Vuz, which means scorn. And you get that scorn in the last line of verse 4, booze. This technique of repeated words, often linking the verses, is true for other of particularly the Shir HaMa'alot, the songs of ascent, and some say that's a quality of that feeling of motion, of stepping, of moving. So the beginning, to you, now here God is being addressed from the get-go directly to you, to God. I lift up my eyes, dweller in the heavens, Hayoshvi Bashamayim. This notion of God is in the heavens is a repeated image. Now, that's different than the image of God who is the maker of heaven and earth. That too is a repeated theme. This is a little bit different. This is, you live up there kind of notion. You get it, in 1 Kings chapter 8, Solomon is dedicating the temple to God. And in verse 27, Solomon would say, Ki ha'omnam yeshev Elohim al ha'aretz. For really, God dwells over the earth. Hine hashamayim ushmei hashamayim. Behold, is of the heavens and the outermost heavens. Lo yechakeluhu af ki habayit hazeh. Much less would be contained in this house, asher beniti, which I built for you. And so there the notion is, and again, you can understand it as metaphor. Solomon is building and dedicating a temple to God and saying, I know, God, you are really transcendent. You are in the heavens, not to be contained here below in a structure. But this notion of God in the heavens, you do get in other Psalms as well, not that common, but you do have it in Psalm 2, verse 4. Yoshev b'shamayim Yitzchak, the one who dwells in heaven will laugh. Adonai yilag lamo, the master will mock them, those who do evil, as if God is looking down at the evil ones and mocking them. Or we saw it just last week, Psalm 121, the opening line, Esa enai el ha'arim me'ayin yavo ezri. I will lift up my eyes to the mountains. From where will my help come? And there the image can be for some, as we saw, that support of troops will come from the mountains, but others will say the mountains point to the heavens. That is the dwelling place in ancient archetype, folk tradition. We still speak about dying and going to heaven, the place of God. And so to you I lift up my eyes, dweller in the heavens. Now, when you lift up your eyes to God, that is an image of hope making. And literally, when I do teach meditation, one of my exercises that I do with my students is I say, take a negative thought and place it on the palm of your hand and keep it, below your waist, your palm, and watch what happens to your breathing. And what happens is, as we look down, we'll find that we will have a hard time catching our breath. It shortens our breath to have our eyes downward. And if you pick up your palm with that negative thought, when you get to just above the horizon, try this as an exercise, you will see that what happens is the negative thought goes away. You can't hold a negative thought easily when your eyes are upward. Your breathing opens up when your eyes are upward. And when you're breathing easy, it's hard to hold a negative thought, unlike looking down where I couldn't catch my breath. So, opening image. I lift up to you, God, to you. It's personal. I lift up my eyes, dweller in the heavens. Now again, the image of God being in the heavens has more than one possible significance. Namely, Adin Steinsaltz will say in his commentary that it underscores, God, why are you so distant? You're not here. We're suffering. So that's one way to relate to dweller in the heavens. Where are you? You are at a distance. Or it can, which was the first part of my explanation, be I turn my eyes to you who dwells in the heavens, because that distinctly reflects your power. You are in the heavens and you can hear me on earth. So it's not a reflection of, if you will, indifference, but God's power. Is it about distance or power? Unclear. That's part of the power of the poetry, the double possibility. And now the only image is verse 2, the metaphor for the situation. And here, the word avadim, I translated as slaves. Often, frankly, in more contemporary translations, tends to be servants. Servants softens it. I chose, as do some, to use the translation of slaves. Avadim hayinu. Slaves we were into Pharaoh in Egypt. So bottom line, I chose slaves to emphasize this is written at a time in which slavery existed, and slavery is more extreme than simply being a servant. Behold, as the eyes of slaves toward the hand of their master. Now, what is the eyes of the slave looking toward the master for? And again, many possible understandings that we can choose. It can be you're looking, it can suggest loyalty. I am loyal to you like a slave. So I look to your hand. I am dependent on you for all that I have like a slave. Or it can be, I am in fear of you, because you use that hand when you're not happy to whip, to hit. My friend and teacher, Martin Cohen, when he teaches this psalm in his book, will leave the key focus as To what degree is religion a product of fear? Focusing on verse 2 and saying, to what degree do we follow God because we are afraid of the uncertainties or afraid of God punishing? I could tell some stories, maybe will at the end, about my own religious crisis that some of you have heard me speak about in that regard. But to keep moving forward, so the image of the eyes, and again, eyes and hands, anthropomorphic quality of God. Hand, again, is a source of doing, of power. And here's something distinctive to this image, and that is the second dimension. As the eyes of a maidservant, a shifcha, toward the hand of her mistress, gevirta. Now that's interesting because here God is being analogized to a mistress, to a woman. And the question then is, it's unusual to also bring in the feminine. It could have been, behold, as the eyes of a slave, and so our eyes are toward Adonai. What does the middle image add? And so the commentators will say, back to Adin Steinsaltz, that the maidservant is even weaker than the slave. So it's like, not just like a slave, but even like a woman slave. So dependent am I. Others would say, Art Scroll, for instance, will say, male slaves work outside, women slaves work inside, so we're covering all the bases. But there is another possibility, and that is there's genuinely a sense of community, the us, that will now unfold more, and it's a way of saying male and female, all of us. So it's a statement of inclusiveness, emphasizing, so our eyes are toward Adonai our God until God grants us grace. And this word grace, we often think of it as a Christian terms. We, meaning many Jews, don't identify God as the giver of chen, though it's very mainstream throughout our sacred text. Grace is the quality of undeserved goodness. That's one dimension. Or it's giving as an act of compassion, expecting nothing in return. That's the flip side of undeserved. God gives it as simply an act of love. Hence, to have the name grace, or in Hebrew, chen, is Anna, Chana. Greek is the translation of the Hebrew, Chana, is to be one who gives without expectation of return, and in that regard gives even what is potentially undeserved for the recipient. And now it gets repeated in verse 3 for emphasis, hence that exclamation mark in the translation. And I translate this as grant us grace. JPS would say, the Jewish Publication Society, show us favor. Chanenu Adonai chanenu, as if only God's grace can change the situation, back to being dependent for change on God. And now this repeated image, Rab Savanu, overly sated. So we've absorbed more than we can hold of scorn. And we don't know here who is scorning us. Overly sated is our soul with the mockery of the smug, the scorn of arrogant oppressors. We don't know if the smug are fellow Israelites, which we've seen also in Psalms repeatedly as the description of the people of power who take advantage of the weak, or it's a neighbor, enemy. Don't know. And this will continue to be the unknown in the next few Psalms as well. That'll have somewhat of a similar theme. This notion of the arrogant, you get repeated throughout. Often we have Ahuvaho with us, who's somewhat expert in the prophet Zephaniah, chapter 3, verses 11 and 12, castigating the arrogant and saying that it's only the humble who will ascend. Or Proverbs, To'avat Adonai kol gova lev, an abomination to God are all of those with a haughty heart. And so this reoccurring counterpart to the righteous is those who are arrogant. Here, in the closing word, you have in parentheses something called Cree. You get this notion in Psalms, sometimes in sacred text, between what is written and what is read. So what is written is lege ayonim, for the arrogant ones, arrogant people, plural. But the Cree, which are the Masoretes, those scribes who finalized the text in about the 6th, 7th, 8th centuries in Tiberias, particularly a family named the family of Asher, who would both put punctuation and vowels into the text. They, instead of saying to the arrogant ones, they made it lig a yonim. And the word yonim is related to the Hebrew word ona'ah, the deceitful ones, or the oppressors. So habuz, the scorn of the arrogant, ge'eh, arrogant, yonim, oppressors. Now, we don't know when this was written, and here's a few different theories. The Oxford JPS commentary says it could have been written during the time and about the Samaritans. The Samaritans were people from outside the land of Israel who were brought into the country by the Assyrians and then also by the Babylonians. They did not respect rabbinic authority later on. And some of those Samaritans opposed the return of the exiles to Judah. And that might have been the context. Those are the oppressors, the Samaritans, those who are telling the Persians not to let us come back. Others say that it might have been about after the return, about their own people who acquired the power. And later, the medieval commentators will say that this is a prophecy. So Rabbi David Kimchi will say that what is referred to is the diet of physical and mental pain, of galut, of dispersion. And this is a prayer to end galut, to bring us back to the land. And who are the scorners? They are the people amongst whom we live who say, there is no God, there's nowhere back to go. So all those are possible. One closing thought in the last few minutes, because I mentioned in passing Martin Cohen in terms of the key image, that of slaves to the hand of their masters, emphasizing that what kept slaves was often fear. It wasn't that the master was benign and they're looking to the hand of the master to take care of them. It's the hand of the master who would force them to work and who would threaten them lest you run away. And the key question he raises is, how much of religion is grounded in fear? So let me just address that on a personal level. I shared in a sermon I gave on a high holidays, coming off of a sabbatical where I traveled with my family around the world, that I was teaching a class to my then high school boys about religions of the world, and we visited many religious leaders who were not the elite. These are religious leaders in local small shrines. So, for instance, we were in Bali, and we sat out with a Hindu leader, the priest of our tour guide. I asked our tour guide if I could meet his priest, and he said to me, I've never had a one-on-one conversation with my priest. I said, why not? He said, well, he has great power. He could curse me if I said something wrong. And so I've never had the courage to speak to him. I said, well, tell him I'm a religious leader. Would he consider meeting me? And this was soon after the tsunami that had killed so many people in Bali and throughout that area of the world. And I said at a certain point, as we were sitting outside at a temple, to the priest, I said, how do you understand the tsunami? And he said, oh, it's very obvious. And I said, well, tell me. He said it was God punishing the Muslims. And I said to him, but many Hindus died as well. My tour guide translator did not translate my follow-up question. He was scared to. And he said to me, but they were mostly Muslims, which knocked the air out of me as an explanation for why the tsunami occurred. I had similar experiences with a young Buddhist monk in Thailand, in Chiang Mai, in which I asked him about who gives blessings, because he had blessed me with a certain gift I'd given him. And he said, oh, the spirits. I said, what spirits? He said, well, every tree holds spirits. And he had told me he had come from a village of animation, where they believed in many spirits, unlike mainstream Buddhism. And he was still attached to the quality of fear and goodness of spirits everywhere, which is the classic motif of paganism. But for me, the most jarring and challenging of all those magic, fearful views of power was a former chief rabbi in Israel. In that, a young woman, her parents came to ask Linda about her headaches after we had arrived in Israel. Linda said, go and get a CAT scan. I'm not sure why, but her gait looks a little funny. And sure enough, she had a brain tumor growing. And the father, who was a religious man, was told, go call the chief rabbi, he's a mystic. He will have a blessing for your daughter. And so he called this former chief rabbi, and the rabbi said to him, here's what I want you to do. The daughter was now in the hospital after the diagnosis and had surgery scheduled a few days out in terms of availability. Go to these graves of these famous rabbis and collect some earth. Create a headband with the earth and go to a local, actually, he said no. The chief rabbi said, go to the local mystic rabbi and come see me Saturday night. He goes to the local mystic rabbi, and the local mystic rabbi says, go to these two graves and get the earth, and here's some oil you'll pour on it, and it'll help your daughter. So while the mother and daughter are in the hospital, the father, who otherwise in life is a pretty sophisticated guy, is gathering his earth. Saturday night, the surgery is supposed to take place the following day. The dad goes to the chief rabbi in Jerusalem, and he goes, to get the blessing. And the chief rabbi says to him, go to the western wall, spell out your daughter's name with prayers, probably like Psalm 119. And, you don't need the surgery. After that, I think it'll be fine. Don't do the surgery. I sense that there's no longer a problem. So the dad's now calls the doctor, who's also, by the way, a modern religious man, and he tells him what the chief rabbi said. And the doctor says, your daughter's vision has become reduced this week because of the pressing of the tumor on her optic nerve. This is an emergency surgery tomorrow morning. We're doing the surgery. The dad is now caught between the holy man, I keep repeating this, no less than a former chief rabbi, and this well-known pediatric neurosurgeon. So he calls a prominent rabbi who acts as an ombudsman, and he says to him, what do I do? And the ombudsman said, let me call the rabbi for you. If he understood the severity of the medical situation, he clearly would not be telling you not to do the surgery. So he calls the chief rabbi, calls back the father, and he says, the chief rabbi says that you should do a CAT scan before the surgery to determine if the tumor's gone away. And if it didn't, then you can do the surgery. And that's what happens. Now, I know the father well. And it's now a few days later. I'm sitting with the parents in the hospital with Linda. And the dad knows I'm a rabbi, but he doesn't know about American Judaism and conservative Judaism so much. He knows I'm a rabbi. So he gives me the letter that he's written to the chief mystic rabbi, and he asks me to read it before he sends it. And of course, I'm outraged by all this magic, by the sense of having not postponed, but creating this catch-22, this bind for this dad by this chief rabbi based on his magic. And he writes in the letter gratitude for his concern and for his guidance. And my sense is he has written out of fear. In other words, I don't want to upset this rabbi. I've already had this prominent ombudsman call him. So he writes him a thank you letter, which only leads to the most deep part for me of religious crisis, namely the link between religion and fear and magic, leaving me as a rabbi wondering how much of what draws people to religion, even in my own community, is based on magic and fear. Ultimately, I gave a sermon about this on Rosh Hashanah while I was still grappling with it. And I know one person left the congregation over that sermon, and she said to me with anger, when I come to synagogue, Rabbi, I'm not interested in your spiritual crises. I come to synagogue to feel uplifted, and left. They don't want my honesty. It took me about 2 years to regain my energy, my focus religiously. I was really deeply troubled by those experiences of the link between religion, fear, and magic. And what changed it for me was the recognition that Judaism and other major religions are, for many of us, all of us as humans, have qualities of vulnerability. And when we are vulnerable, we have a need to shout out. We have a need to pray. We have a need to express our deepest longings. And that's okay. And also, religion evokes our greatest qualities of hope, our greatest qualities of the need to be good, our greatest qualities of having a longer and bigger trajectory of what it means to live a life of belonging and goodness. And so that religion also evokes, at its best, the best in each of us. And that realigned me, that sense of balance. So to pull that together, we are like slaves before the hand of the master. I probably would choose to read this as we are servants before the hand of a master. To own our creatureliness, our transience, our limitations, is to be aware of fragility, humility, and ultimately the preciousness of the limited time we have. And so, to answer Rabbi Martin Cohen's question, to what degree does this express a religious mindset? It does. Part of us, particularly when we are feeling hopeless, will express that hopelessness, asking for grace, asking for goodness by a greater presence than we deserve. But I personally don't see that as an act of intervention magic. I see that as enabling us to draw hope, faith, strength by a belief of a greater presence of goodness that evokes our own goodness. With that, before we turn to Richard, any thoughts or reactions? Marion is eager to respond to Psalm 123.
I was thinking you were saying that fear and magic are a draw to religion, and I'm thinking it's what's turning a lot of our young people off. Is they don't want to have fear of God. They don't want to have the magic that's associated with all of the religion. They want something else.
So Marion shares that this emphasis in this psalm, and we find it throughout sacred text, the mindset of Yireh Shamayim, the fear of God, which is also, by the way, the word used for the non-Jewish righteous we saw in earlier psalms. And I tend to translate that word as awe of God rather than fear, for that very reason, Marion, that I find I am more motivated by a sense of wonder, of wow.
But you may be unique. I think a lot of our young people are taught fear of God.
Yeah.
And why should they participate in anything that would cause them fear? I have 2 grandchildren who don't want anything to do with religion because of various ways they've been taught about fear of God.
I hear you, and it's why, again, I respond to fear fearfully in terms of the health of, here's a free association. I mentioned that these psalms, Shir HaMa'alot, the songs of ascent, were used for our local synagogue because of a place called Ma'alot, which was a town in northern Lebanon in which there were children in an overnight school outing, sleeping in a school, and a terrorist, this is 1973, 2 terrorists came into that space and they threatened to blow up all the children unless some other terrorists were released from Israel's prisons. And Israel had a rule of not negotiating with terrorists because it could lead and feed the need, more hostage situations. And it was a very painful situation because the whole country knew of the situation and was waiting to see how Israel would respond. And ultimately what they did is they sent in commandos, but there were a number of children killed in the process of the release. So it was a very painful collective experience. And there was a rabbi who was no less than a member of Knesset from the far right religious party who claimed that the problem was that there were too many mezuzot that weren't written correctly that had led to the tragedy. Because I was living in Israel at the time. I was aware of his comment. This again is, this is like a member of the government. And it was like, there's no words for the kind of, rage that comes with the use of magic over tragedy. But that happens. It happens to some, but it's not my religion orientation. So I acknowledge it, Marion. That's my free association from Shir HaMa'alot and Ma'alot. Literally in response to Ma'alot, that was the one response. But I find that to be out of touch with reality and ultimately out of touch with the goodness of God. Any Ashula?
First of all, I have to say that when I read this psalm, it was very visual for me. And I felt a great sense of discomfort because, especially in verse 2, I literally saw the servants as if on their knees, looking up at the eyes of the master and the mistress, asking them to help. But I have to tell you, I don't see any fear here because they say, we're going to be here. We're going to be in front of you with our hands outstretched until you give us grace, because we've had it. We've been mocked enough. We've been made fun enough. We've been oppressed enough. If there was fear of meek servants, meek slaves, it would have said, help me, because I'm nothing. I'm such a nothing. I'm like a grain of earth or whatever. It almost reminiscent of the story of Choni HaMe'agel, Choni the circle maker, who stood in the middle of the circle and said to God, I'm not moving till you make rain. This is where I'm staying. And they're saying, we're going to be here like this until you give us grace because we've had it.
So I'm going to have a use of the Zohar building off of Shula's insight that this is, so again, we're given choices how to experience it. But Shula, you're in good company in that I'll show you a unique word in the psalm. I'm fascinated how many psalms have a unique word. Here, the opening verse, dweller in the heavens, is a unique word, hayoshvi bashamayim. It normally should be hayoshev bashamayim. And the Zohar will ask why this choice of words, and they'll point to the Yud, that smallest of Hebrew letters. In Parsha Ve'etchanan, in the Zohar, they will say that this Yud represents the innermost part of the heart that links the human heart with God's presence. It's that part of us that embodies the Shekhinah, the little Yud, the 10th Sphira, and that we are saying to God with the innermost point of our heart, let your heart, God, be stirred. In that regard, as Shula says, this is a statement of strength, of I am speaking to you, Hayoshvi, as the one who sits in heaven, who has, if you will, given me this dimension of you. That's an extraordinary statement as understood by the Zohar of strength. One other commentary on this word, Hayoshvi, is Samson Raphael Hirsch, who will translate it as, who is enthroned for me. So Hayoshvi, my enthroned, my enthroned one in heaven. Again, a statement of strength on some level of you are enthroned because you need subjects, and that's me. Your power is because I see you as my king. So plays, if you were homiletically, if you will, homiletically, on this unusual choice of words in verse 1. So with that, I'm going to give Richard the last word. And again, I pause with a sense of wonder over the artistry of the Psalms. The stepping stones that I pointed out, which we'll continue to see, this anadiplosis in terms of being written with such a sense of movement, of arising, an uncertainty as to the historical context, and an uncertainty even as to the nature of the middle metaphor, and yet opportunity by a unique word to describe God, and also a rare expression of God as male and female in the metaphor, to see this as a psalm of inclusion and connection. With that, Richard, a closing word.
Well, I must say that I very much appreciate your approach to Psalms and the character nature that you bring to it. Also, Kenner Shula's comments about verse 2 here of the Psalms. In thinking about, since this is a Psalm study, I was thinking, what Psalm most represents me as an individual? And frankly, I find myself in many and most of them. But I think of those that are candidates, I think Psalm 19 represents me. It's a psalm that I resonate with very deeply. And in fact, unfortunately, I wasn't able to be here for the Psalm 19 presentation. So I did want to hear what you had to say, unfortunately. But I do see that the whole arc of Psalm 19 moves from, if I may, in fact, I'll just leave it at that. If I can unpack it just a little bit, but if we have time, but I don't have to.
Just say in a sentence or two why 19.
Okay.
I will add for the group. Psalm 119 begins, Hashemayim misaprim kavod el, the heavens declare the glory of God. So it's creation-based, and it's, in that sense, about awe and wonder. Keep going, Richard. Just a sentence or two before Kaddish.
Okay. In fact, that is the starting point for me, is that sense of awe and wonder that I have for this universe. And I'm one of those people who see God's hand when I look at the universe at any scale. I see God's hand as the author and creator of the universe. But then that it moves to that almost abrupt change to Torah and its value to the individual. And then the value of Torah, moving then to the idea of being concerned about mishandling it or not being able to follow it. Finally, to that final expression, Yehu l'ratzon emrifi, v'hegion libi lefenecha, Adonai tzuri v'goali. May the words of my mouth and the
thoughts of my heart.
The thoughts of my heart find favor before you, Adonai, my rock and my redeemer. To me, that whole flow is very much representative of who I am. So anyway, I'll turn this back over to you, Rabbi Spitz.
Oh, that's beautiful, Richard. And I want to say that it's delight making to hear you personalize Psalms and to know this particular Psalm 19 has motifs that particularly inform your spiritual worldview. And I am reminded that the line you just quoted in Hebrew, I am wowed, Richard, is the line we say at the very end of our Amida. Each time we pray our standing prayer, we ultimately leave with the last expression of our lips, the last words of Psalm 19. So a very beautiful and powerful psalm rooted in awe of the majesty of creation and simultaneously the care of the Creator for us as individuals. So Psalms, so rich. Tomorrow's Psalm, Psalm 124, seems to be, or is at least juxtaposed with our Psalm of today, Psalm 123, as a psalm of assurance, of God's caring presence.